The clang of a tin bowl echoed like a gunshot in the silence of the Langston Ranch dining hall. One of the older ranch hands, Clay Dempsey, squinted at the gray mush in his bowl like it had personally offended him. "Garrett," he muttered, stabbing his fork into the slop. Even the coyotes would spit this out. Another man, barely 20, banged a dented pot onto the table. 14 hours of fence and cattle, and we eat boiled sadness every night. A few chuckles bounced off the wooden walls, but it was strained laughter. This was the third cook in 2 months, and morale was as dry as the Texas dust coating their boots. From the doorway, Garrett Langston's shadow darkened the mess hall. He didn't speak right away. He was a broad-shouldered man with wind-burned skin, his face carved from ranch life and grief. When he did speak, his voice was calm but firm. "Anyone think they can do better?" He nodded toward the kitchen. Doors open. No one moved. Then shut up and eat. The room quieted. Garrett turned and walked out the screen door, snapping shut behind him like punctuation. Outside, the wind kicked up a wave of dust across the dry prairie. The air smelled of cattle sweat and old disappointment. That night, in the office that had once been a nursery, Garrett sat at a desk no one had touched in weeks. Across from him on the windowsill sat a photograph, his late wife, Claire, smiling in a way that no longer seemed real. He dipped a pen in ink and began to write in short, blocky letters. Cook wanted. Prepare 3 meals a day for 12 ranch hands. Must handle heat, long hours, and rough conditions. Room and board. Apply in person. Langston Ranch, northwest of Dry Mesa. He underlined in person twice. No letters, no dreamers, just someone willing to show up. He figured no woman would. He figured wrong. 7 days later, the wind was restless again, swirling grit across the open land. Garrett was outside loading sacks of feed when the ranch dogs began barking, not in warning, but in confusion. Through the heat shimmer, he spotted someone approaching the gate. Not a man, a woman. She wore a sun-bleached bonnet tied low over her face. Dust caked the hem of her dress, and her boots looked one step from giving out. She held a baby against her chest, wrapped tightly in faded linen. She walked with the kind of steadiness you don't fake, bone-tired but focused. "I saw your notice," she said before Garrett could get a word out. "Name's Eliza Monroe. I can cook." He blinked. "You came here alone. I had a wagon. Left it a mile back when the axle snapped." Her voice was dry but strong. She didn't avert her gaze. Didn't explain more than she had to. Garrett's brow creased. "Didn't expect someone like you. I figured, but mouths don't care who made the food." By now, a few of the ranch hands had wandered over. One smirked. Another muttered, "We hirin' mothers now." Eliza didn't flinch. She adjusted the baby's blanket and said, "I'm not asking for pay. Not yet. Just shelter. Food. A place for my son to sleep." She didn't look desperate, Garrett noticed. She looked determined and exhausted, like someone who'd fought too hard to be turned away by a man who hadn't smiled in years. He could have said no, should have maybe. But instead, he heard himself say, "You cook tonight. If the men don't complain, you stay." Eliza nodded once. "That's fair." The cookhouse was barely more than a shed tacked onto the main house like an afterthought. A crooked stove, cracked shelves, and a pantry that hadn't seen a proper inventory in years. Eliza didn't waste time looking overwhelmed. She unwrapped Jonah, her son, just a few months old, and set him in a wooden crate lined with flour sacks. The baby gurgled softly, unfazed by the heat and clatter. Eliza rolled up her sleeves and got to work. She found sacks of old cornmeal, a strip of smoked pork, and half a jar of molasses. No butter, but a tin of lard would do. As the fire roared to life and the smell of frying pork filled the air, the men outside fell quiet. When dinner was served, they approached with folded arms and raised brows. Clay, the same man who'd complained that morning, took a bite of cornbread. He chewed. Then again. He looked at Eliza and said, "What the hell is this?" "Dinner," she replied. He grunted. "Tastes like 5 cents well spent in town." And then he cleaned his plate. Garrett watched it all from the doorway, saying nothing, noting everything. The way she stirred with one hand and rocked Jonah's crate with the other. How she never asked for help. How she moved through heat and tension like she'd been born in fire. Later that night, long after the lanterns dimmed, he walked past the cookhouse again. Through the warped window, he saw her kneeling by the hearth, feeding logs into the flames. Jonah slept nearby, bundled tight. Then Eliza pulled out a small tin and dropped dried mint into a kettle. When the tea was ready, she opened the door. "You've been coughing," she said. "Dry air. Figured this might help." She handed him a steaming bowl. Garrett didn't say a word. Not then. But when she left it by the door and disappeared back inside, he stood there a long time holding that simple bowl like it meant more than it should. And for reasons he wouldn't admit yet, he drank every drop. The next morning, the scent of bacon fat and cornbread drifted across the yard before the sun had fully cleared the ridge. For the first time in weeks, the bunkhouse stirred early, not with groaning or griping, but with curiosity. Boots shuffled and doors creaked open. One by one, ranch hands emerged into the soft golden light, sniffing the air like hunting dogs catching a familiar trail. Inside the cookhouse, Eliza Monroe moved with quiet certainty. Her baby Jonah, swaddled in flour sacks and tucked in a crate near the hearth, dozed peacefully while she worked. She handled the ancient cast-iron skillet like it was an extension of her hand, flipping pork slices with a worn spatula and stirring a pot of molasses-thick beans with the other. Her face, lit by firelight and framed by damp tendrils of hair, bore the calm of someone too busy surviving to worry about impressing anyone. The men gathered around the long table cautiously. Last night's dinner had surprised them. This morning's breakfast had them downright suspicious. "She'd do that again," Clay muttered to no one in particular I might propose. The laughter was lighter this time, real, almost easy. When Garrett Langston entered the mess hall, the room went quiet for half a beat. He nodded toward the plates. "Well," Boss Clay said with a grin, his mouth half full of cornbread, "I ain't saying she's a miracle, but this biscuit's warmer than my last marriage." Garrett grunted. "That's supposed to be a compliment." "I ain't divorced it yet," Clay shot back, and a round of laughter followed. Garrett watched from the edge of the room as Eliza moved between the stove and table, calm as morning fog. She didn't smile, but she didn't frown either. She worked like this was just the next thing to get through. After the meal, the men cleared their plates without being told. Someone even offered to haul water from the well. Garrett raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He was used to silence, to loneliness, to the dead air that settled in the corners of his house. But that morning it felt like the ranch had exhaled for the first time in years. Later that day, while the men were out fixing fences and checking cattle, Garrett found himself outside the cookhouse again. He didn't plan it. His boots just took him there. He knocked once and pushed the door open. Eliza was bent over a wash basin, her sleeves rolled high and her hair tied with a frayed ribbon. Jonah slept nearby, his tiny chest rising and falling in the slow rhythm. "I didn't mean to interrupt," Garrett said. "You didn't." She stood and wiped her hands on her apron. He hesitated. "Just wanted to say breakfast was good. Better than a boiled boot." He looked down, caught, slightly. A trace of a smile touched her lips, barely there. "Then I'll count it as a win." He nodded once, then lingered a moment too long. The silence stretched, not uncomfortable exactly, just unfamiliar. Finally, he cleared his throat. "You find everything you need. I've worked with worse." She turned back to the basin. "This place has bones. Just needs a little care." He didn't answer. Instead, he walked over to Jonah and looked down. The baby's fists were curled, his mouth open in sleep. "He don't cry much," Garrett said. "Only when he's hungry or I stop rocking him. Good baby." "No such thing," she said quietly, rinsing a dish. "Only ones that learn early how to be quiet." Garrett didn't know what to say to that, so he left. That night, after another meal that had the men wiping their plates clean, Garrett noticed something odd as he walked past the cattle pens. A small patch of earth behind the fence, where nothing ever grew, now held 3 little rows of green. He crouched beside the plants. One was mint, he recognized the smell. Another looked like wild daisy. The third, he didn't know. Broad leaves, dark veins. A hand-lettered sign stuck in the dirt read "Bone Set." He straightened as Eliza emerged from the shed, a basket in one hand and Jonah wrapped against her chest. "They don't take up much room," she said evenly. "I didn't say anything." "You didn't have to." He watched her walk past barefoot quiet as moonlight. She didn't ask permission, just planted what needed planting. 3 days later, near dusk, a young ranch hand named Levi staggered in from the west field, pale as ash and shaking. The men rushed to him, calling for the doctor in Dry Mesa, 2 hours away by fast horse. Garrett shouted, "Get the wagon!" But Eliza was already there. She knelt beside the boy, placed 2 fingers on his wrist, then leaned in and sniffed his breath. "Milkweed," she said sharply. "He's chewed it by mistake." The men froze. "Is he gonna die?" someone asked. "Not if I act now." She handed Jonah to Garrett, who took the child without hesitation, surprised at the ease of it. Eliza sprinted to the kitchen. Moments later, she returned with a jar of yellow root and a cloth pouch. She mashed the root, added mint, and spooned the bitter mixture into Levi's mouth, 1 drop at a time. The men watched, hats in hand. Clay mumbled a prayer. After 30 tense minutes, the boy stopped shaking. His breath evened out. By morning, he was sitting up sipping broth. By lunch, no one called her the cook anymore. They called her Miss Eliza, and someone tipped their hat and said "ma'am" like she was born to the role. Garrett watched from the porch that evening as she sorted herbs into little bags, Jonah cooing nearby. The sun cast the whole world in copper and rose. And for the first time in 2 years, Garrett Langston didn't feel like something was missing. He just felt still. 2 weeks had passed and the rhythm of Langston Ranch began to change, though no one said so out loud. The men still rose at dawn and worked until their hands blistered, but now there was laughter around the water trough. Meals arrived on time and hot. Boots were wiped before entering the cookhouse, and every evening, without fail, a pot of tea steeped gently on the corner of the stove, a different herb in the blend depending on the day mint for headaches, chamomile for sore backs, and yarrow for cuts and bruises. They still called Garrett boss, but the cookhouse that was hers now, Miss Eliza's, and no one dared treat it otherwise. Garrett stood by the barn one morning, arms crossed, watching her step barefoot across the hard-packed earth. She held Jonah on her hip, swaying gently as she picked through the herb patch she'd planted behind the cattle pens. Mint, bone-set yarrow, even a sprig of goldenrod had managed to sprout despite the dry earth. Somehow, things grew where she touched them. "You always walk barefoot?" he asked, stepping closer. She looked up, squinting into the sun. "When the ground doesn't bite back." He chuckled, rare and soft. "You sure you're not half outlaw, half medicine woman?" My grandmother was Cherokee, she said. Lived past the river bend outside Arcona. Taught me everything I needed to survive. She bent and gently plucked a few leaves. Said the land offers both cure and curse, you just have to know the difference. Garrett nodded. He didn't press further. He had learned by now that Eliza spoke when there was something to say, not when there was space to fill. Later that same day, near sundown, another scare hit the ranch. A steer collapsed by the watering hole, foaming at the mouth, eyes bulging. 2 others swayed unsteadily nearby. The herd had been acting strange all week, lethargic, coughing, some refusing to eat. Garrett ordered the sick one shot and buried, thinking it a fluke. But by the next morning, 6 more had gone down. 30 others looked sick. The grass in the western pasture had turned from hay-colored to a dull grayish-white curling like parchment in the wind. The hands were spooked. One whispered about a curse, another mentioned bad water. Even Garrett looked shaken. He stood at the fence line that night, hat-off hands gripping the post, like it might answer him if he held on tight enough. The town doctor had come and gone useless as a screen door in a sandstorm. Could be rot, could be poison, could be God's will. He muttered, offering a bottle of laudanum and no solutions. Garrett didn't say what he was really thinking, that this might break the ranch for good. Eliza didn't come to supper that evening. Garrett found her near the fence line, kneeling in the dust. She wore her apron, still dirt caked on the hem. Her fingers worked through a fresh cow patty, grimacing as she studied the texture. "What are you doing?" he asked. She stood, wiping her hands on a rag. "It's not rot. It's not a curse. It's what they ate. Poisoned. Not intentionally. There's a plant that grows when grass dies backspurge. Looks like milk leaf. Cattle eat it when they're desperate. It causes ulcers, fever, slow death." Garrett's chest tightened. "Can you fix it?" "I've seen this before," she said, already turning toward the woods. "My grandmother treated a whole herd in Cherokee land. I'll need bark, papaya root, ash from mesquite. I'll need your help." Anything he said. For 2 days, Eliza didn't rest. She boiled bark until her fingers blistered, crushed leaves and herbs with the back of a ladle sweat darkening the bodice of her dress. Jonah lay beside her in the shade of the barn, swaddled and calm, as if he understood his mother was saving lives. Garrett stood beside her during treatment, holding the heads of sick animals while she spooned the bitter paste between their jaws, massaging their throats until they swallowed. Some resisted. Some vomited. Some rose to unsteady feet, blinking, breathing better. By the end of the week, while ranches in the county were losing entire herds, Langston Ranch had only lost 7. 80% survived. And Garrett Langston began to look at Eliza Monroe differently. Not as a cook, not just as a mother, but as something else entirely. That night, Eliza collapsed in a bed of hay in the barn, arms streaked with ash, sweat-drenched and spent. Garrett stood in the doorway watching her as the oil lamp flickered across the beams. She looked up at him, exhausted. "It's not luck," she whispered. "It's knowledge." He didn't say a word. He just walked toward her, and for the first time since Claire's funeral, wrapped his arms around someone else. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't careful. It was the kind of hug a man gives when the world stops punishing him for just a second, and he remembers that it still holds things worth protecting. Eliza didn't speak. She just let herself be held. And in the quiet, beneath the beams of the barn and the faint scent of smoke and mint, Garrett realized that maybe, just maybe, the cold was starting to break. By the middle of August, the sky over Dry Mesa had gone weeks without a drop of rain. The earth split in deep cracking lines like veins in old hands. Grass turned brittle and the air shimmered with heat that clung to the skin like grief. But inside Langston Ranch, life kept moving. Eliza's herb patch still clung to its corner of earth behind the cattle pens. Mint boneset and goldenrod persisted under her watchful eye, watered with leftover dishwater and hope. Jonah, now stronger and louder, had taken to crawling toward the nearest sunlight patch, grabbing fistfuls of dust and cooing at his own shadow. Garrett noticed the difference more each day. The men had started asking her questions what to use for bee stings, how to boil root for sleep, whether peppermint or willow bark worked better for headaches. Eliza answered them like a teacher speaking to kin, not students. And they listened. No more muttered jokes about the cook. She had earned her place. Garrett began rising before the sun. Not because he needed to, but because he wanted to fix the crooked kitchen window before she noticed it had cracked again. The old back step that had nearly tripped her twice rebuilt. He sanded the edges smooth so she wouldn't catch her foot when carrying Jonah. He didn't mention it. She didn't thank him. But every repaired board was its own kind of apology and invitation. Then came the visitors. They arrived one bright afternoon, rolling up in a fine covered wagon, dusted but spotless, pulled by well-groomed horses. 4 men, all clean-shaven with pressed vests and shiny boots. Too shiny for real work. They didn't look like they'd ever lifted a bale of hay, let alone eaten beans off a tin plate. Garrett stepped out from the barn, arms crossed. "Can I help you?" The lead man, hat tipped low with a fake smile, said, "Heard your ranch's been doing something special. Survived the cattle sickness, got a little magic cook, ain't that right?" Garrett's jaw tightened. "We sell beef, not stories." The man's smile sharpened. "Well, that's just it. We own a fine establishment in Amarillo. Could use someone like her, knows herbs, knows how to keep a man calm, relaxed. Room board, good pay. She won't be mistreated. Our clientele are influential." Behind Garrett, Eliza had stepped onto the porch. She said nothing, but Jonah stirred in her arms. "I see," Garrett said. Then, without warning, he punched the man square in the jaw. The stranger hit the ground like a sack of oats. His companions stiffened, reaching for their coats, maybe weapons, maybe not, but Garrett had already drawn his rifle. Cold and steady. "You've got 10 seconds to get off my land," he growled, "before I forget I'm a peaceful man." They left without another word. But they didn't forget. 3 nights later, the ranch lay still under silver moonlight. The cattle shifted quietly in their pens. Crickets chirped. Inside her new room beside the kitchen, Eliza slept lightly. Jonah curled in the cradle beside her. Then came the sound a floorboard creaked where no one should be. Eliza shot upright. The window was open, and the cradle was empty. She screamed. Garrett bolted from his bed at the sound, grabbing his rifle and a lantern before his boots fully hit the floor. Within minutes, they were both on horseback, thundering into the mesquite thicket, following fresh tracks that cut through the underbrush like a wound. Eliza rode hard, fists clenched around her herb pouch, her heart threatening to claw its way out of her chest. She didn't cry. She didn't break. They found them near the creek bend, those same 4 men hunched around a low fire. One of them was holding Jonah in his jacket, laughing as the baby whimpered. Eliza dismounted before the horse had stopped moving. "Give him back," she said, her voice sharp and cold. The leader sneered. "You should have come with us, sweetheart. Now you got no choice." Garrett fired once into the dirt near his boots. "Let the boy go." Instead, the man lunged toward the fire, dragging Jonah with him. Eliza moved faster than thought. She reached into her pouch, grabbed a handful of burned bark and powdered ash, then flung it directly into the man's eyes. He screamed, dropping Jonah as he clawed at his face. Eliza dove, catching her son just before he hit the ground. She clutched him to her chest, sobbing silently, rocking him as his cries pierced the stillness. Garrett leveled his rifle again, but the other men had already backed away. They didn't say a word. They vanished into the trees. Garrett walked to Eliza's side, knelt, and gently pressed a kiss to Jonah's forehead. Then, just as gently, he helped Eliza to her feet. She didn't let go of the baby. She just leaned into Garrett's chest and let him hold them both until the first light of dawn broke through the trees. Back at the ranch, no one spoke of it directly, but everyone knew. From that day on, someone always walked the fence line at night, and Garrett built a latch on every window in the house, silent but firm. Eliza said nothing of what she'd done, but the look in her eyes had changed. Not harder, just clearer. She had fought for what was hers, and no one questioned it again. Garrett began spending more time near the cookhouse. Not intruding, just being there. He'd sit on the porch after supper with a mug of tea, listening to the sounds of Jonah babbling inside the creak of the rocking chair Eliza had restored from the barn. The quiet between them wasn't awkward anymore. It was shared. And in that silence, Garrett finally felt what he hadn't felt in years. Safe. The days grew cooler, though the rain still held back. The dry season clung stubbornly to the Texas plains, but something softer had taken root at Langston Ranch. It wasn't just the return of health to the herd or the herbs blooming behind the pens. It was in the way the men carried themselves. How they greeted Eliza with respect, how they lowered their voices when Jonah slept, how they nodded at Garrett and meant it. It was in the silence, too. The kind Garrett used to hate, now made warm by the sound of baby laughter, the scrape of chairs being tucked in after supper, the rustle of muslin pouches filled with healing leaves. Garrett had grown used to the feel of Eliza's presence like wood smoke or spring water. Subtle grounding. She never asked for more than what she had, never tried to change the house, but somehow it had changed anyway. He found himself doing things he hadn't thought to care about before. Fixing the shutters, sanding down the railing she leaned on each morning, replacing the warped kitchen door with one that closed with a whisper instead of a bang, and still she said nothing. Until one morning, Garrett was outside hammering fresh boards into a frame beside the cookhouse, when Eliza appeared, wiping her hands on her apron, her hair tied in a blue ribbon Jonah had pulled from her braid. "You lose another window?" she asked lightly. He didn't look up. "Nope." "Storm damage?" "Nope." She stepped closer, narrowing her eyes at the rough shape forming beside the wall. "What is it, then?" Garrett wiped sweat from his brow and finally looked at her. "It's a room. For you. Bigger than the corner you sleep in. Separate entrance, proper roof, closet." Eliza froze. "You didn't have to. I know." She placed her hand on the fresh pine. "You're not asking me to leave when spring ends, are you?" He shook his head. "I'm asking you to plant things that'll need summer to grow." The silence between them swelled like a rising tide. Eliza smiled small and soft, the kind of smile that comes from deep in the ribs, not just the lips. She didn't stop him when he reached for her hand. And he didn't let go. No one else in the wide stretch of Texas would have recognized the moment for what it was. But between them it was louder than any wedding vow. Weeks passed. A new sign appeared at the front gate, carved by Garrett's own hand. Burned letters read, "Langston and Monroe Ranch Home, Healing, Honor." The men didn't say much when they saw it. They just nodded and touched the brims of their hats. It felt right. But peace, as always, doesn't last forever. One cool autumn morning, a tall stranger arrived on foot. He was old gray beard-patched coat leather shoes worn through at the sole. He asked for water, sat beneath the elm by the well for hours just resting. When Eliza brought him a mug of tea, Jonah riding on her hip, the man looked up, eyes soft. "You ain't just feeding mouths, miss," he said. "You're feeding something deeper." Eliza raised a brow. "And what's that?" He pointed to Jonah. "That boy's smiling because he believes the world can heal itself. You taught him that, just by staying still." He tipped his hat and walked on, leaving dust and silence in his wake. That night, Garrett sat beside Eliza on the porch, the mug of peppermint tea warm in his hands. They didn't talk much anymore, didn't need to, but the silence between them had changed. It wasn't something to escape, it was something to share. "I used to think silence meant something was missing," Garrett said softly, "but not anymore." Eliza glanced sideways, a question in her eyes. Garrett cleared his throat. "Eliza, I ain't asking you to be here 'cause I need a cook. Lord knows you're more than that. I ain't good with words, and I ain't got no ring, but I don't want another sunrise to come without you being just one room away." Her throat caught and she looked down, blinking hard. "I came here with nothing but a hungry baby and desperation," she whispered. "Now you're asking me to stay forever." "I'm asking you to be my home," he said simply. She reached out and cupped his face, tears glinting in her lashes. There really is spring after the coldest March. They married 3 days later beneath the great oak behind the barn. There was no preacher, no choir, no lace, just lanterns strung between fence posts, laughter carried on the wind, and Jonah wearing a crown of wildflowers giggling from Eliza's hip. Caleb played the harmonica, more enthusiasm than rhythm. Clay roasted a hog over an open pit. The ranch hands danced like men who hadn't had a reason to in years. Eliza wore a cloak the color of mint leaves. Her hair was braided with the same ribbon Jonah had stolen from her earlier that week. She walked barefoot down the path between hay bales, hand in hand with Garrett. When they reached the tree, she looked up at him and whispered, "Took you long enough, cowboy." Garrett smiled a real one. Not tired, not reserved. The kind of smile that cracked a man's face open after years of drought. Their vows weren't written down. No one signed a thing, but everyone there knew it was real. The days after the wedding were quiet in the best way. The air carried the scent of firewood and fresh bread, and even the dust that swept across the yard felt gentler somehow, like it knew the land had changed. Inside the house, Jonah had taken his first steps. Not many, just a few proud wobbly strides between the table and Eliza's outstretched arms, but enough to earn cheers from every hand on the ranch. Garrett carved a notch into the door frame to mark it, smiling as the boy babbled and reached again for anything he could grab. Langston Ranch had become something it had never been before. Not just a workplace, not just a home for livestock and broken men, but a place where things grew hearts included. Garrett still rose early, but now it was to make sure the kettle was hot before Eliza stepped out with her sleepy eyes and shawl. She would yawn, kiss Jonah's hair, and thank him with a tired morning cowboy before disappearing into the garden. They had started expanding it, adding lavender sage and wild onion bulbs. Eliza had even drawn plans for a greenhouse using salvaged glass and scrap wood. Garrett didn't argue. He just started collecting what she needed, hauling it in wheelbarrows at dusk, while Jonah tossed rocks into a rusted tin bucket nearby. The men still worked hard, still sweated under the sun, but something in their rhythm had softened. They asked after Jonah when he had a sniffle. They helped Eliza gather herbs on their off hours. Clay even brought her a cracked porcelain jar he'd found buried behind the barn, thinking she could use it for whatever fancy leaf tea you're always making. Garrett watched it all with a quiet awe. He hadn't expected this when he posted that cook notice. He hadn't even hoped for it, but somehow it had found him. One evening, as golden light stretched across the pasture and the cattle moved like shadows toward the far fence, Garrett sat beneath the great oak with his guitar resting on his lap. It was the first time he'd played since the wedding. His fingers moved slowly at first, rusty on the strings, then steadier as he found the melody. It was Claire's tune, one she used to hum while making jam in the old kitchen. It had no words, but it didn't need any, just notes full of memory and motion. Eliza stepped out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. She didn't speak. She simply stood there watching. When the final chord faded into the wind, Garrett looked up. "I used to think that song belonged to the past," he said. She walked toward him, barefoot as always, and sat across from him in the grass. "It don't," she replied. "Not anymore." He set the guitar aside and leaned back on his hands. "You ever think about how it all started? You walking in with that baby. Me thinking you were trouble." "I was trouble," she said with a smile. "Still am. I never said thank you," he added. She looked at him. "You didn't have to." The ranch was quiet that night. Not empty, just peaceful. Eliza sang softly to Jonah, rocking him in the cradle Garrett had built from reclaimed cedar. The child's eyelids fluttered, then closed one chubby hand gripping a bit of his blanket like it was treasure. Outside, Garrett tended the coals in the fire pit, sipping tea from a cracked mug. He stared at the stars, so many of them out here where city lights didn't chase them away. He used to think the sky was empty. Now he saw how full it really was. Eliza joined him a moment later, settling beside him with a sigh. Her head came to rest on his shoulder. "You think we'll make it?" she asked softly. "We already are," he said. She nodded. "Sometimes I still wake up wondering if I dreamed all this." Garrett looked at her, at the hair that curled around her face, at the soft lines of exhaustion and strength in her eyes. "You didn't dream it. You built it." She leaned into him. "So did you." By winter, word of the ranch had spread. Folks came not just for work, but for healing burnt-out riders, fevered drifters, even mothers carrying children of their own. Eliza never turned them away. If they came honest, they stayed. If not, Garrett saw them off with no apologies. And Jonah. He ran now, fast and loud and full of the kind of joy only children who've been loved from the start can carry. One afternoon, Garrett hoisted him onto his shoulders and said, "You see that horizon, kiddo? That's ours now." Jonah giggled and shouted, "Go faster." Eliza stood on the porch, watching them with a hand on her belly. She was showing. They hadn't told anyone yet, didn't need to. The land was changing again, greener this time, softer, like it had been waiting for them to grow into it. Life doesn't always come at you in straight lines. Sometimes it rolls in like dust on the wind, a stranger with a baby, and a steady gaze, a cook who heals more than wounds. And sometimes healing doesn't look like medicine. It looks like fixing a porch step without being asked, like holding a baby so someone else can breathe, like standing guard in the dark for someone you love. Garrett Langston thought he had buried his best years with his wife. Eliza Monroe thought she was just surviving, but together they learned that love doesn't only live in easy seasons, it grows in hard-won springs. If this story touched something in you, if you've ever felt broken or like your best days were behind you, let this remind you there's still good waiting, still soft places to land, still someone out there who sees what you carry and says, "Let me help." Comment below if this story reminded you of someone strong in your life. Subscribe to Whispers of the Wild West, because every trail leads to the heart.